They told you royalty smelled like roses and lavender. They lied. The truth is that European monarchs spent centuries marinating in their own filth, and the reasons why are so disturbing, so deeply rooted in religious paranoia and medieval pseudoscience, that when you actually understand what was happening behind those palace walls, you'll never look at a period drama the same way again. Because here's what they don't tell you in history class. For nearly 400 years, the wealthiest, most powerful people in Europe believed that water, specifically hot water touching your skin, would quite literally kill you. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They genuinely believed that bathing would open your pores and let disease, demons, and death itself crawl inside your body. And they acted accordingly. We're talking about kings who went months without bathing, queens who were sewn into their undergarments for entire seasons, nobles who masked the smell of their rotting flesh with perfumes so strong that servants would faint from the fumes. And the medical establishment, the physicians, the scholars, the people who were supposed to know better, actively encouraged this madness. They wrote treatises about it. They prescribed it. They turned the avoidance of water into a moral virtue and a sign of sophistication. So when you see those lavish paintings of Louis XIV or Elizabeth, looking immaculate in their jewels and brocade, understand that what you're actually looking at is a corpse in waiting, a human being so encrusted with their own biological waste that their skin was literally changing texture, becoming something closer to leather than flesh. Let's start with the why, because the medieval mind was a beautiful, terrifying thing. After the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, people needed explanations. They needed to understand why entire cities had been wiped out, why the plague seemed to strike randomly, why God had apparently abandoned them. And the explanation they landed on involved something called miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air, through corrupt vapors that seeped into your body through any opening. Your mouth, your nose, and most dangerously, your pores. Public bathhouses, which had been wildly popular in medieval Europe, became death traps in the public imagination. When the plague hit, bathhouses were among the first casualties. Cities closed them. The church condemned them. Physicians warned that bathing, especially hot bathing, was essentially inviting death into your skin. And here's where it gets twisted. This wasn't just superstition. This was official medical doctrine. Physicians in the 15th and 16th centuries genuinely believed that your skin was a protective barrier, and that water, particularly hot water, would dissolve this barrier. They thought that the heat would open your pores, and that once your pores were open, all the diseases floating around in the air would rush into your bloodstream. They wrote detailed medical texts explaining that cold water was slightly less dangerous because it didn't open the pores as much, but still risky. The safest option, according to the leading medical minds of the era, was to not bathe at all. But people still smelled. People still accumulated filth. People still had bodily functions that resulted in some truly horrific situations. So what did they do? They developed what they called dry cleaning. They would rub their bodies with linen cloths, supposedly absorbing the sweat and grime. They would change their undergarments, their shirts, their shifts, and believe that this was sufficient. The logic was that the cloth absorbed the impurities from the skin, so you weren't actually dirty if you changed your shirt frequently enough. This is why having vast wardrobes of linens became a status symbol. It wasn't about fashion. It was about proving you could stay clean without touching water. The wealthy would go through multiple linen shirts per day, each one becoming increasingly stiff with dried sweat, oils, dead skin, and whatever other biological substances were seeping out of their bodies. And when those shirts became too disgusting even for them, they'd simply burn them, because washing them in water would, according to the medical wisdom of the time, contaminate the water supply and spread disease. Now let's talk about what this actually looked like in practice, because the reality is so much worse than you're imagining. King Louis XIII of France, who ruled in the early 17th century, was reportedly bathed exactly twice in his entire childhood. Twice. His physicians were so terrified of water that they only allowed him to be cleaned when he was visibly, undeniably, disgustingly filthy. And even then, they diluted the water with wine and herbs, thinking this would somehow make it less dangerous. His son, Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who built Versailles, the epitome of French elegance and refinement, took exactly 3 baths in his entire adult life. 3. We have court records of this. His attendants documented each bathing as a significant medical event, something requiring preparation and consultation with physicians. The rest of the time, he simply marinated. His doctors advised him to wash only his hands and face, and only with alcohol or perfume, never plain water. His body was rubbed down with linen cloths, but never submerged, never properly cleaned. And here's the kicker. This wasn't seen as disgusting. This was seen as refined. This was proper noble behavior. Taking a full bath was what peasants did, what lower-class people who didn't know any better did. The aristocracy had evolved beyond such primitive needs. The women had it worse, and that's saying something, because the men were already living in conditions that would make a modern biohazard teen flee in terror. But women's fashion in the 16th and 17th centuries was specifically designed to make bathing impossible. Those elaborate gowns, those corsets, those layers upon layers of fabric, they weren't just fashion statements. They were architectural projects. Getting dressed could take hours and require multiple servants. And once you were in those garments, you stayed in them. Weeks would pass. Months sometimes. There are documented cases of noble women being sewn into their corsets and undergarments at the beginning of winter and not being cut out until spring. The stitching would be done with the woman inside, pulling the fabric tight, and then she would simply live in that cloth prison until the seasons changed. You can imagine what happened to the fabric. The sweat, the menstrual blood, the fact that underwear as we understand, it didn't really exist. So every bodily function was happening directly against these garments. The fabric would become stiff, discolored, crusty. It would start to rot while still being worn. Women developed skin conditions that had never been seen before and have never been seen since rashes and lesions and infections that came from spending months in contact with their own decomposing clothing. And they knew. They absolutely knew how disgusting this was. That's why perfume became such an enormous industry in this period. We're not talking about the delicate floral scents you buy today. We're talking about perfume so concentrated, so overwhelming, so chemically aggressive that they were less about smelling good and more about obliterating the smell of decay. Nobles would douse themselves in these perfumes multiple times per day. They would soak their clothes in them. They would burn incense constantly. Versailles went through thousands of pounds of incense per year, filling every room with smoke, trying desperately to cover the fact that the entire palace smelled like a mass grave. Visitors to European courts in the 17th century consistently described being overwhelmed by the smell. Foreign ambassadors from the Ottoman Empire, from Persia, from places where bathing was still a daily practice, would arrive at European palaces and be absolutely horrified. They wrote letters home describing the stench, the visible filth on the noble's skin, the way the entire court seemed to be rotting from the inside out. But here's where it becomes truly disturbing, where it crosses from disgusting into psychologically horrifying territory. Because this wasn't just about being dirty. This was about what happens to the human body when you don't clean it for years. Your skin begins to change. The layers of dead skin cells, oils, sweat, and environmental grime build up into something that's almost armor-like. Historical accounts describe nobles whose skin had developed a gray-brown tinge, a permanent discoloration from years of accumulated filth. Their pores would become chronically infected, leading to constant low-level skin infections, boils, abscesses, pustules that would never fully heal because the source of the infection was never removed. There are medical records from the period describing a condition they called the royal disease, which was essentially chronic dermatitis caused by never bathing. The skin would crack and bleed, particularly in the folds, under the arms, between the legs, and the groin. These cracks would become infected, but the infections would be treated with poultices and ointments, never with the simple act of washing the affected area. So the infections would persist, becoming permanent features of the body. And it gets worse, because your body doesn't stop producing oils and sweat just because you're not washing. It accumulates, it oxidizes, it turns rancid. There are accounts of nobles whose hair had become so matted with years of accumulated oils that it had essentially turned into felt. They couldn't have combed it if they wanted to. It had become a solid mass. And in that mass, things lived. Lice, obviously, everybody had lice, but also mites, fleas, sometimes even larger parasites. The wigs that became fashionable in the 17th century weren't just a fashion statement. They were a solution. Your real hair was so disgusting, so infested, so beyond salvaging that it was easier to shave it all off and wear a wig. But even the wigs became infested because the scalp underneath was never cleaned. Servants whose job was to maintain these wigs would report finding dead insects, insect eggs, and in extreme cases, maggots feeding on the organic matter trapped in the hairpieces. The dental situation deserves its own horror story. Without proper hygiene, without even the basic concept of cleaning your mouth, teeth would rot. But it wasn't just cavities. The accumulated bacteria would cause gum disease so severe that teeth would literally fall out, sometimes multiple teeth at once. The gums would recede, become infected, abscess. Kings and queens would be giving speeches or eating meals, and teeth would just drop out of their mouths into their food. This was normalized. It was expected. By age 40, most nobles had lost half their teeth. By age 50, many had lost them all. And the breath, the smell that would come from a mouth full of rotting teeth and infected gums, was so overwhelming that courtiers developed the practice of holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces during conversations, ostensibly as a fashion accessory, but really as a desperate measure to avoid vomiting from the stench. Queen Elizabeth I, who lived to the relatively old age of 69, was reportedly down to a handful of blackened stumps by her final years. And that iconic white makeup she wore, that pale face that's become synonymous with her image, that wasn't just fashion either. It was a mask. A literal mask made of white lead and vinegar, covering skin that was scarred from smallpox, perpetually broken out from never being properly cleaned, and probably developing precancerous lesions from the toxic makeup itself. She would apply this makeup in thick layers, sometimes over an inch thick, building up a false face over her real one. And she never washed it off properly. She would just apply new layers over the old ones, day after day, until her attendants would have to physically scrape off the accumulated makeup every few weeks, revealing skin underneath that was raw, damaged, and actively decomposing. The medical consequences were catastrophic, but they were misunderstood. Nobles suffered from constant infections, from sepsis, from diseases that we now know are caused by poor hygiene, but they had no framework for understanding this. When people died from what we would now recognize as infections caused by their own filth, physicians would blame bad air, or divine punishment, or constitutional weakness. Never the fact that these people were essentially living in their own waste. The irony is almost beautiful in its cruelty. They avoided bathing because they were terrified of disease, and in doing so, they created perfect conditions for every disease imaginable to flourish. Their fear of water killed more people than the plague ever did, but slowly, persistently, rotting them from the outside in over decades. And they passed this knowledge down as wisdom, as refinement, as the mark of civilization. For 400 years, the nobility of Europe chose to be walking corpses, and they did it because their doctors, their churches, their entire society told them that cleanliness was dangerous and filth was safety. That's the real horror. Not that they were dirty, but that they chose it believed in it, and died defending it.